So I'm Justin Varney Bennett.
And I'm Mark Varney Bennett. And we're married, of course.
Yeah, even wore the rings today. Ta-da! So yeah, over to you, honey.
Okay, so I was going to give it being Black History, my experience of being, I guess, Black in England or London, the UK, and I guess that going a bit into being Black and gay in the UK. I'm very conscious that I'm speaking from my experience, and it might be quite limited, and there are probably other people other persons of colour who have a very different experience to mine. So I've got to say how old I am. I'm 45, so that you can know how far back in time we might be starting. So I grew up in southwest London. I was born in southwest London. Did all of the education of the first 20 years of my life in southwest London, in fact. And I grew up in a Christian household. It was a specifically West Indian Christian household, and specifically Jamaican. And I had a really good sense of what culture was, because certainly what Black culture was, because I grew up in a religious household that was predominantly a West Indian church-going household, and we went to the same church for about 20 years, and it was a predominantly Black church. It was predominantly West Indian Jamaican. There may have been some other West Indian people there, and maybe around the middle bits we had certainly some Black people from other countries like Africa and America as well, I guess. So I was lucky in that sense, that it gave me a good grounding, a good understanding of what my culture was, what it meant to be West Indian. I didn't have a chance to get to Jamaica or go to Jamaica until I was about 20. In fact, I grew up in quite a low-income family, single-parent family, and I didn't have the means to travel until that time. And even that was when I was working that I got to travel and go to Jamaica and see that firsthand for the first time. We had quite a in terms of school, the school that I went to, the primary school that I went to in London, I was lucky, really. I wasn't ever, Tooting was, where I grew up, was a multiracial place, multi-ethnic place. And so I was lucky enough not to be the only Black kid or the only kid of colour in the school, and certainly not to have been the first. So I was lucky enough not to face any racism then. The only racism that I found that I faced growing up was perhaps at secondary school, when I said to my head of year, I'm thinking of becoming a doctor, and his response was, "Oh, you should go into nursing instead." And whereas by contrast, there would have been other students of other colours who would have been encouraged to, pursue their dreams, go to Oxford, sit the Oxbridge exams and stuff, and do that. And I think that was the real first sort of taste of the kind of discrimination in terms of accomplishment and aspiration and encouraging children. I think that's such an important thing to do. Growing up and then moving a bit further on into to university, the university that I went to, that I studied at, they scandalously had a program that could recognise or calculate the probability on the basis of somebody's name, their spelling, the probability of them being of a certain ethnicity, and actually would send out invitations based on that, send out more invitations to names that sounded more British than ones that sounded foreign, and it was hauled up for that, and it was and they changed their ways after that, I have to say, to become quite welcoming. So going back to church, we had a really it was interesting growing up in church for me, because our pastors, although they were West Indian, one of my pastors, and we had two male pastors in our church, both Jamaican, but one of them, to all intents and purposes, appeared to be Caucasian. He looked Caucasian until he spoke, unless he explained to you that he was actually Jamaican. He actually appeared to be Caucasian. So certainly my growing up, and certainly the way that I grew up in my family, my mum raised me, that there was never a kind of a sort of them and us kind of thing. Except that, as I said, our church was so heavily stylized as being Jamaican, and I guess I think for the purposes of it being a place of comfort, a kind of home away from home for Jamaicans, that I think we didn't necessarily go far enough to welcome people from other backgrounds and places. So that's kind of my experience. I was quite kind of in an insular place. I didn't get to go to things like the Notting Hill Carnival, because it was seen as being very sort of ungodly, sort of. So for me, even seeing that kind of that sort of side of culture and having that kind of history and being able to see the contribution that I guess black people have made in the world to so many different areas and to art and to music. Coming on to the sort of being gay, I came out of this church, this very strict, fundamental, West Indian, Pentecostal, conservative church. I came out quite explosively. I'd been in the closet for about 3 years, and when I was about 38, I came out as having been in this relationship, closeted for 3 years, and so I left the church, knowing how sort of how fundamental their position on being gay would be, and that there was no way that I could stay there. I have to say again, I was very lucky in the sense in going to that church. I didn't face a lot of, there wasn't a great deal of backlash at all, and in fact, in the years before I came out, when I struggled with gay porn, and struggled with same-sex attractions, which was the kind of language that I would have used then. I can remember my pastor speaking to me and saying, "Look, Mark, whatever you do, don't leave the church. Just put away all that gay stuff, and whatever you do, keep on going to church." And I think that I was lucky to have, in a sense, quite such a gentle approach, even though it was obviously verging on the kind of conversion therapy type of, kind of like you can just stop being gay. That's where they were coming from. But again, I was fortunate not to be, I guess, not to suffer from church burn, as I call it, that kind of experience that many people that come from very, very strict and very sort of fundamental church backgrounds face that kind of rejection. I was lucky, I guess, partly because I was running away from that, but partly because I think they had dealt with this before, and they sort of, I think, knew how to navigate and not hurt people from those experiences. And so I can remember coming into the relationship with Justin, and one of the amazing things coming from this very Christian background, and I'm a musician, as some of you know, so the whole church music scene was an amazing thing for me. Justin gave me a book called, I think it was called Children of the Gospel. Mm-hmm. That was an amazing book. It was an amazing eye-opener. It was written by a Jewish guy, and he had interviewed personally many black gospel musicians over the decades, I think going right up from like certainly the 50s and 60s going forward. And it was amazing to hear his kind of account of the interviews that he had with them, and how many of these black musicians, they would not have necessarily been out, but there was quite a number of them who were gay, who were closeted, and it was really kind of affirming to see both the contribution that these gay black Christian musicians had made to music, and certainly to church music, and over the decades, and how that had carried through even into modern day gospel music, and all of the kind of influences that had. So certainly for me, transitioning and coming here to Oasis, coming from my background, I found that really affirming place and base and knowledge base to have. Yeah, that kind of is my history so far, partly. Then there's us.
Our history, yeah. I suppose my kind of reflections a little bit are, I mean, firstly, the coming to Oasis. So whenever we travel, certainly for the first 4 years of our relationship, pretty much everywhere we went, if there was a Sunday, we had to find wherever the church was, like the gay church, all around the world.
Yeah.
Which meant one of my introductions to kind of queer church was MCC in New York, which is super gay, like super gay. And I think, as many of you know, I don't share the same faith. So I come from, although I was raised in predominantly a kind of Zen Buddhist approach, I went to a Protestant school. I have probably a melange of belief, more than any particular prescribed religion. So yeah, it was really interesting going to that MCC in Hell's Kitchen, which is up a tiny little set of staircase. If any of you go to New York, really go. The Reverend Bumacre, isn't she?
No. Bumgardner.
Bumgardner, that's it. Reverend Bumgardner, who is fantastic. You know, she's in her late 70s. She was one of the founding members of MCC at a time when churches were turning away LGBT people because of the fear around HIV transmission. But we sat there in a service in which the person giving the sermon talked about the woman and the well, and the story of the woman at the well, and how that was all about trans people. And I was like, that wasn't quite the way I learned it. And so it was a really interesting experience, and she was an Afro-American lesbian woman, very strident preacher. So that was a really interesting experience. And each time over a couple of years, whenever we traveled, particularly in the US, we saw very different inclusive church, ranging from the Cathedral of Hope, which, huge. I mean, it is just like a Disney palace. And they have a full orchestra, and it's streamed live in 2 languages, and there's an incense thing going, and and that was like the 8 o'clock service, and it was packed. It was incredible, and they gave us, they gave us pen. Yes. Everywhere we get, people give us things as well. So I have like this little collection of mugs and things that people have given us, which has been kind of cute. But I think some of the interesting experiences as we've kind of been together as a couple. When we were in New York, quite early on, wasn't it? We were walking, so we tend to hold hands a lot. We're very connected. And we don't do very well when we're apart, actually. It's like that umbilical cord that connects you. You can stretch it so far, but it has to come back together every now and again. Anyway, so we were walking around New York. We've been there about 4 or 5 days. We hold hands everywhere. I'm big and ugly enough that, frankly, if you've got a problem, I'll take it up with you. And we're standing at the traffic lights in Hell's Kitchen, and across at the other side of the traffic lights, there's like a gang of young people. And it's only about 6 o'clock in the evening, but Mark has a tendency to carry his wallet in his back pocket and not be desperately switched on about crime, do you? So, and I'm very crime aware. So I was a bit like, honey, move your wallet. And he's like, why? I'm like, the kids, just move your wallet, put it in your front pocket, it'll be fine. Anyway, so we cross the lights, and all my prejudice about gangs of young people in hoodies comes out. So I'm like, got my hands near my pocket, know where my phone is, and I'm ready. And we cross the traffic lights, and one of them goes, excuse me. So I'm like, yep. And I'm all geared. And he was like, we just want to say thank you. And you remember, I was like, thank you for what? Thank you, you're going to rob me? What is it? And they were like, no, thank you for being so visible. We've seen you guys walking around Hell's Kitchen in the last couple of days holding hands, and we don't see interracial couples in New York. We see black guys with black guys, and we see white guys with white guys, but we don't see interracial gay couples. And we're a really mixed group of queer friends, and we just want to say thank you because it's been really great to see you. And then they crossed the lights. And part of me was like, oh. But part of me was like, wow, actually how important that visibility is and how different it is. And one of the interesting spaces I think we've experienced as, from the interracial kind of point of view is actually we've had a lot of experiences where we've gone into communities which are very black. Think about when we were in Chicago. We do a lot of road trips. We love road trips. It's a really great way to see America. And usually Mark drives. And I do the navigation. And any of you who experience it will see I'm quite directive. And you think I'm just bossy. It's not. It's actually Mark's got a really bad sense of direction. So that's why. We've learned. We've been together years now. We know how that works. Anyway, and we were trying to find somewhere to eat, weren't we? And I was like on the TripAdvisor, like you do, going, where's good? And Mark doesn't like fast food. So he doesn't let me eat it very often. Got to be really desperate, and then I might just about get away with the Taco Bell. But McDonald's, I have to sneak out on my own. And we found this place, didn't we?
Yeah.
We pull up, and it's like a house. I mean, this is really rough bit of Chicago, because that's the other thing. I'm a bit blind to rough bits. Like, unless it's dark, and then I'm very conscious of them. But during the day, I'll go anywhere. I used to work in Whitechapel. I'm like, you're not going to scare me that much. And Whitechapel in the early 90s and late 80s, trust me, was not nice. Now it's trendy. Before Shoreditch and hipsters. Yeah. Anyway, so we go in, and everyone's black. And the menu was scrawled. I mean, everyone was black. Everything was broken. The menu was scrawled on a whiteboard, and there were kind of utility metal trays with collard greens and fried chicken. And you could have heard a pin drop. Like literally, I opened the door. Mark went in first, and they were like, la, la, la. I walked in, and it was like,
stop playing the piano.
It was literally, and I'm like, anyway, so then we went up to order, and I'm quite fussy about meat on the bone, but I was like, no, I'm just going to swallow it. I'll be okay. But when I was like, I'll have collard greens and I'll have this and that, and they were like, fine, you're okay, you're fine. But it was it's interesting sitting on that other side of that experience when you experience that kind of otherness. But then we've had other experiences in Berlin when we checked it, so because we now have a double-barrel surname, so we check in with British Airways of all airlines, and the woman behind the counter goes, "Are you brothers?"
True story.
And it took me a moment, it really did, to kind of go, sorry. And you could see the little cogs turning where she realised quite what she just said. And I went, no, we're married. And she was like, oh. And then the cogs wheeled some more. And she went, oh, that's interesting. How lovely, you've got a double-barreled surname. And then we got our tickets and got through. I was gutted because it was like we didn't get an upgrade or anything like that. But it's been interesting from that perspective, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been good.
So the other thing I think I want to share is, so when we first met, Mark's father was terminally ill. And Mark's father had a very fun life, shall we say. So Mark comes from a very large extended family. There are lots of half brothers and sisters, many of whom we actually only ever met at the funeral. But before he died, and he had been very sick in intensive care and high dependency, and then he came home basically to die. And it was about 2 months before his birthday, give or take. So there was a decision that they would move forward his birthday party so that everyone, the family, could kind of come together. And Karen, who's Mark's stepmom, was like, you're coming. Like, there's not an option. It wasn't really a choice. Just make sure you bring some food. I have learned that early on. Jamaican culture, always come with food. Never eat beforehand because they're going to fill you full of carbs. And we went, and the family were 99% of them were really welcoming, and then one or two were a bit like, "Who are you?" And I'm like, "I'm Mark's boyfriend," and they were like, "Okay." And through the day, people went up to spend time with Mark's father. So he was upstairs in bed, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. And at one point, I think Karen or Anthea, Mark's half-sister, came to see us and said, "He's asked for you." And I was like, "Okay, honey, go. I'm fine. I'll be all right. Don't worry. They're not going to bite." And she was like, "No, he's asked for both of you." So we both went up and spent, wasn't long, it was a few minutes with him. He was very tired. But he'd done it as a very conscious decision. So we went up together, and the whole family knew we were being asked to be seen together. And when we came down, there was an absolutely a kind of shift in that welcoming. They were very nice, they're lovely people, but there was that point at which it's like, now you're family. The kind of patriarch has said, you are now part of the family. And that's played through, and although we don't see them a huge amount, they came to the wedding, they engaged in our wedding really well. And absolutely now I am part of the family. Yeah. But it was a really powerful moment of kind of Mark's father, really in his dying days. He died very soon after that, didn't he?
He did. Yeah.
Making both a clear statement on our relationship, but also a clear statement of acceptance of Mark. And, I thought that was really powerful and a really important thing. Whereas my family have kind of just had to put up with me being queer forever. So it's a slightly different environment. But yeah, it's been an interesting journey so far, and there's a long way to go yet. But yeah, and so we're happy to take any questions if anyone wants to ask us anything.
So,
I was drugged out.
He was drugged out.
I'd had surgery.
So I'd been working at a practice, and there was one of the partners of the practice was a new guy, and he happened to be one of Justin's co-leaders or co-chairs of this gay lesbian doctors and dentists group called GLAD, and they had their annual AGM. It was a dinner, so there's this room full of probably twice as many doctors as there are people here, and then there's this guy sat at the table where I am, and I'm like, oh wow, that's nice. and that's basically it. I saw this guy and I thought, wow, he's pretty amazing. So it was really interesting actually, because I then used, I don't know if you remember, it's still around, Match.com. So I used Match.com, put my preferences and stuff into there, and actually he came up as one of my top matches anyway, which is like incredible. So I've been stalking him ever since.
Then he tracked me down, and the thing I think the thing that has been great in many ways is when we met, I had spinal surgery about a month previously. So I walked with 2 sticks. I was taking a lot of pain medication. I put on a lot of weight. I was absolutely at one of my all-time lows. And Mark loved me at my worst. And so he's seen me at my worst and kind of at my best some of the time. And loved me in that moment. And that I think has been a really strong foundation for us. And he's quite a persistent bugger when he wants to be as well. So it's kind of cool.
In terms of what I've heard, I think it's very difficult, and even moving to other, maybe even parts of the West Indies, and maybe even in the church that I was in myself. So I was very lucky in my family, as you heard. I was lucky that my dad was so accepting, which is unusual for a West Indian family, but certainly was the case. And I know that there will be other individuals for whom, from other countries, from be it South Africa or other African countries, Ghana, Nigeria, where coming out would just it wouldn't be accepted. So it'd mean that they would have to you know, they might be kicked out of the family, they would be ostracized from the family, they would, you know, certainly they wouldn't be able to go to their church anymore. It could be really, really devastating. And so it's very difficult. I knew individuals that also, I know for certain individuals who come from some countries, let's say Uganda or something like that, that I know they just could not be gay in that country. For example, they could face punishment, death, imprisonment, torture, all kinds of things, and yeah, it's really tough. I guess that there are certain protections from being in England because you are in England, and because I think because there are so many LGBT people, there's such a wide community. You can find a family, you can find a group of friends, and you can make a network. So you almost have this fallback. If you are rejected by your family, you can create one, or you have one. I think that's a really lucky thing in London particularly. I think people in other parts of England or other parts of the world don't have that resource, I think.
I mean, I think also, so I come at it from a perspective of kind of part of my day job for many years has been LGBT work. And I support an organisation called the Rainbow Railroad, which is based in Canada. It's a global charity that runs a people railroad. So it helps get people out of countries where there's a death sentence. It's illegal. And last year, they moved over 200 people into safety, which is fantastic. And all of that's from charitable donations of people giving money, which I give every month to. And what's really interesting is the demographic of who calls for help. So they have coordinators for Africa, for the Middle East, for countries like Turkey, Iran, but also from the Caribbean. And the vast majority of their calls come from people from the Caribbean, which is really interesting actually about how the different, where people fear for their lives. So these are people who really fear that they're going to be killed because they've been outed. So it's really worth looking at their website and reading that. We also went, do you remember the meeting we had with Jide from House of Rainbow? So I've known Jide for many years now. And there was a piece of work that I did with Public Health England where we had money to work on black and minority gay men. And we set up a learning set, and the learning set had a learning set for faith leaders, a learning set for black community leaders, and a learning set for LGBT community leaders. And the idea was these were closed learning sets where people could reflect on inclusion of black and minority ethnic people in their communities from LGBT backgrounds. And what was really interesting was the LGBT group sat there and went, we haven't got a problem. We're fine, we're really super inclusive. And the facilitator went, yeah, let's take a copy of Boys and let's just try and find anyone in it who's from an ethnic minority group. Now that was the group that then went on to run the GMFA survey on racism in the LGBT community, and have actually really done a lot of work since then over the last 4 years or so, where organisations like London Friend and LGBT Foundation have gone, actually we need to be a bit more inclusive and we need to reach out and build bridges. The black and minority ethnic group went, yeah, we're inclusive. And again, the mirror was held up and they kind of went, okay, we need to do a bit of work. And out of that came the Race Equality Foundation's group for BME trans people. And they're really focused on supporting BME trans people and creating a safe space for them. And what was fascinating was the faith group met in secret, wouldn't have their names on any documents, and the majority of them came from black African churches. And they were pastors and faith leaders who came into the room and said, I want to know more and I'm on this journey myself, but I don't want my congregation to know because they are not there with me yet. And we had some amazing faith leaders who at a one-to-one level absolutely got it. But absolutely said, my house, my job, my home is at the whim of my congregation, and my congregation absolutely don't get it. So if someone from my congregation comes to me on a one-to-one, I absolutely will support them in a positive way, but I will also support them to find another church because it's not safe in my church. And I'm going to start chipping away at this and building a different community and start to create that, but I'm not going to be able to turn it around. And I think that's one of the really interesting differences or experiences. And as Mark says, we forget in London where there's a group for everything. I mean, if you want to do gay taekwondo or you want to go to gay Turkish night, there's something for everyone. And we've had Bootylicious as a black gay club for, ever since I came out, which is far too long ago. And but actually, if you go to Bristol, or you go to the Isle of Man, or you happen to be, black and gay growing up in Newcastle or Norwich, there's not a lot. And you're really reliant on the internet. And one of the other things we learned when we were doing this piece of work was how little positive imagery is. So particularly black gay men stereotyped and sexualized in pornography and in imagery. So the only time we'd see a black person is if they're kind of smothered in oil and bent over. And if you saw a black lesbian woman, she was basically wearing Nicki Minaj. I mean, it wasn't a dignified approach. And we did a piece of work where we took a whole load of positive images to build into image banks and to try and change that narrative. And I think there's still a huge long way to go in changing the social narrative within the LGBT community as well as within the black community. Because when we have this conversation, we go, this is all about black churches chucking out gay people, this black community. And we don't go, actually, this is about walking into a gay club and every poster, everything being white. And I think, I've been in this world for a long time, so I come from a slightly different perspective. But I know I come from a deeply privileged perspective. And when we went to Morocco, we do travel a lot, I should say that. It's great. I'm a big fan of air miles. And we went to Morocco, and firstly, every single person in the street just shouted Obama at you. It's like, Obama, Obama. It's like trying to get them into the store. But I was quite surprised. There are not a lot of black men in Marrakesh. It was quite interesting. I was quite surprised. Anyway, we went into the bakery where they bake the bread in the ashes of the Hammam, of the steam baths. And there's basically this group of teenage boys do all the baking. Anyway, we walk in and they were ecstatic. I mean, they got really excited. And I was like, well, it wasn't over me. What the hell's going on? And they all wanted selfies. Anyway, they thought Mark was a footballer. I still haven't quite worked out which one. But it was that really interesting experience of where I kind of have that moment when I realized, actually, there's a huge amount of privilege I have. There is virtually nowhere in the world that as a white man I can't walk into. There are lots of places we've been in the world, Vietnam as well, where you were the only black person in the room most of the time. Yeah. And I don't think we consciously think about it because when we're together and, and we are well off and we're educated and we're pretty empowered. But for a lot of people, they don't have that. And I think it's really important to remember that and remember how much privilege we have in London and how much privilege we have in England that around the world people don't. And a lot of people come here because it's the only hope they have of being their authentic selves. So that was an awful ramble answer to your question, but I hope it was useful.
I'd only come out by the time I was into my general practice life. But so it's difficult for me to talk about how the hospitals are. There are only I can only remember a few doctors who were really out, and I think that it was I think that it's the sort of thing that people would sort of whisper about and sort of snigger about the other stuff. But I'm going back 15 years. I'm going back a long time to try to remember what hospital medicine might have been like then. I've got colleagues I could speak to, and I could just ask, and maybe Justin will fill in on that to give a more contemporaneous viewpoint. In terms of the current place where I'm at, again, I recognise that I've been really lucky. So the general practice that I work in, I'm out as a gay man that's married to Justin. In fact, one of the amazing things, he always manages to he always makes the receptionist cry in my surgery because he randomly sends flowers to me.
It's a good tip to keep your relationship sweet. Send random flowers.
Send random flowers. He sends these random flowers, and the receptionists are like, "Oh my god!" And they start crying over that. So I guess I'm really lucky again. That I'm appreciated. You know, loved. Justin's loved through, you know, indirectly, that, you know, through them. So it really fortunate to be supported in my workplace. Am I out to the patients? No, I don't think that the GPs don't normally get to discuss that. Patients don't really ever ask me. I don't really ask about wives or kids either. And
he keeps moving rooms, so it's not like there's a photo of me on the desk. But you also have Clark Kent, like you. So Mark, when he goes to work, wears a bow tie.
Yeah.
Like with whatever colour shirt, it's only something he can get away with. I could never do it. And it's really interesting, like we've walked past people in the street at the weekend where he's wearing like normal clothes or a t-shirt, and they absolutely blank him. They've got no idea. It's like the bow tie is work mark. It's like Clark Kent and his glasses for Superman. If he takes the bow tie off, he's no longer Dr. Bennett. It's like gone.
That's true.
I mean, I think just, you know, the more national picture is we've still got a long way to go in the NHS to make it inclusive. There was a report by Stonewall in 2015-16, I think it was, Unhealthy Attitudes, which surveyed a large sample of doctors and nurses and found that well over a quarter had experienced direct homophobia, biphobia or transphobia from colleagues in the NHS. And there's further work the BMA have done actually, I think last year or the year before, which was more qualitative interviews. And situations, there was one situation in which a paediatric doctor on a ward round picked up a baby to examine him, and the nurse, who was from an African background, took the baby and said, "You shouldn't be allowed to handle children," and prayed over the baby. Now, what was shocking was that the rest of the doctors in that group, on the ward round, didn't challenge it. Didn't go, actually, this is not okay. There are several cases of lesbian, bisexual women who go and have their cervical cancer screening test, so they go and have a smear, and the nurses prayed at them or preached to them. Now, the vast majority of the room is male, so you really can't understand quite how incredibly vulnerable it is to have your legs up in stirrups. Some of you may have had your legs up in stirrups, but it's a different experience for a doctor when a doctor's at the other end. But actually, you know, that is probably one of the most vulnerable positions a patient can be in. And to then have that abused by someone who preaches at you when you're in that position of vulnerability is not what the NHS is about. So we have a huge amount to do. We know the NHS also has a long way to go on racism and on creating inclusion. And we know from the national evidence base that if you're LGBT, things are bad. If you're black and LGBT, things are worse. If you're disabled and LGBT, things are even worse. So it's a kind of hierarchy of discrimination. And the more minority aspects you have, the more that kind of weighs you down in life, that compounding. So I think we've still got a long way to come in the NHS. And it's one of the areas where I'm still very active, although I no longer practice in a clinical way, in terms of helping to encourage a more diverse and inclusive leadership and to talk about it. Because if we don't talk about these things and we're not honest about people's experience, then they just stay hidden away and everyone thinks it's fine. And it's still not fine. One of the things I've really reflected on our experience, is one of the reasons we still hold hands, apart from we love each other still, but is how many people have come up at various points and said, thank you. And I don't consider myself a role model particularly, and I don't consider us a role model couple. There are loads of things we don't do great. Flowers make up for it a lot of the time. And but actually, how many people come up and just go, thank you for being visible? Because it's helped me see that there is a positive opportunity, that I can have the life that I want to be, that I can be my authentic self, and it's possible within the working environment. It's possible to have a great relationship. It's possible to be an interracial relationship and that to work. And particularly juniors in the healthcare system who've messaged me and gone, just thank you for being out there. And too often I think we forget how important it is to be visible and to be in that space. And that takes us back to the New York story. I hope by being here tonight and taking part in this and having the glamorous lights and the video recording, but out there are people that will see this and will go, and it sounds trite, but no, it does get better. And, it's not perfect. All of us will have days which are down and days that are up, but it will get better. And I hope by simply being visible, we help that a little bit.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.